collegefootballnerds.com coming at you with a little more bowl coverage. Going to talk Texas and Georgia. Going to get into a couple of others this week, so keep an eye out for those. I don't know when this is going to drop, Josh, because it gets a little hairy around Christmas time with kids and family and everything, getting some editing done. So anyway, if you want to remind everybody, please subscribe. Texas Y'all had a little bit of an introduction to us when we were called SEC fans. We've had a rebrand, but we did the Oklahoma-Texas Conference Championship game. Had a lot of positive feedback from you guys. So go ahead and just hit that subscribe button. And either way, subscribe or not, let us know in the comments what you think this score is going to be. And we've got an SEC Big 12 situation going on, and there's a lot of heated discussion in the Alabama-Oklahoma one, conference to conference. So keep it clean and make sure you back it up with data. All right, Josh, let's get going. Georgia is coming off of a game that a lot of people said should have put them into the playoffs because they played Alabama so close. You and I both said not so fast. Georgia probably shouldn't be in the playoffs, even though they might have played their way into one of the four best teams in the season. They needed to be punished for not only having two losses and not winning your conference championship, but also that blowout loss to LSU. Texas is a team that managed to beat one of these playoff contenders or one of these playoff teams in Oklahoma, and they lost to them close at the end of the year in the conference championship game, which I will say it was a 5-point game until that awesome throw to Calcaterra. I think it was like 2 minutes left in the game, made the score look a little wider than it was. But talk a little bit. Let's just get this thing started with kind of like we did with the Alabama-Oklahoma discussion in that Georgia's coming into this a big favorite. Everybody says this is going to chance for an SEC to show their dominance. But do you have some thoughts on how maybe the contrast of styles might be a challenge early on for Georgia, even kind of like it was last year in the Rose Bowl?
Georgia all year has really had success because, one, their defense hasn't given up big plays. Now, Georgia's defense is very efficient. They're a defense that, for the most part, keeps other teams from scoring because they don't allow you to drive the length of the field. Georgia's defense, and we sort of flagged this a couple of times this year, statistically hasn't necessarily dominated teams snap to snap, I should say. Georgia's 16th in the country in S&P defense. And it feels like if you watch Georgia and you see their scores, they're a lot higher. But what Georgia's been able to do is keep everything in front of them, sort of keep it under control, not give up a big play. On the other side of the ball, you have a Texas team that is, one, Texas is sort of shockingly bad at, moving the football on the ground. Rushing S&P plus, they're 43rd, passing S&P 42nd. Not necessarily an elite offense by any stretch of the measure, but it's a little bit surprising for a team that has the reputation for being so physical in the Big 12 that they are so really pass heavy. I think the thing that is going to be interesting for Georgia in this game is Texas has really big physical receivers. Texas, it kind of varies a little bit, and it's hard to peg down whether you want to say Texas is or is not a big play team. I think to a large extent, offensively, they do rely on big plays. But to me, the big play from Texas is really a lot of jump balls, a lot of maybe what would normally be considered lower percentage throws. And they have big targets that are able to get up, get that ball and come down with it. I think that's going to be an interesting matchup for Georgia. Georgia, really in the SEC this year, I think has made their hay by being very fast and athletic. They haven't had a tremendous amount of success in getting, like I said, the efficiency metrics. The fact that they don't get a tremendous amount of stuffs and stops at the line of scrimmage. They have disruption in terms of tackles for loss. Somewhat, but they're trailing towards the back of the SEC in most of those categories. So again, for the most part, you're going to get kind of into the secondary, and then Georgia swarms, gang tackles you, and Georgia may be 12th in the SEC in sacks, but Georgia being 12th in the SEC in sacks doesn't really do justice to the fact that Georgia constantly never really lets you do what you want to do. They create a lot of turnovers. They had tremendous ability to score off turnovers early in the year. They did it against that's how they blew out Missouri, right? Started that game with a turnover. South Carolina, same thing. And I think what Texas does that's a little bit different is because of the way that they sort of thrive in those one-on-one matchup situations. I think Georgia isn't going to be able to just swarm to the ball and bend but don't break the same way that they're used to. Texas is going to take advantage of that, kind of move the ball a little bit more methodically in terms of just, we're going to throw the ball 12 yards down the field 3 times in a row. And Georgia typically hasn't really been great at stopping people from doing that and completing one of them. And it's going to be disjointed, but they're going to slowly kind of grind down the field and get some points on the board, maybe a little more, I think, than some people would anticipate.
You know, it's, to me, I like the fact, if I'm a Texas fan, that Texas is built a little differently than a lot of Big 12 teams in that they do, you know, statistically it's not great, but they do play good physical defense in a way that a lot of other Big 12 teams, especially Oklahoma, don't play. They're bigger on both sides of the ball. They've got big physical wide receivers that are fast, but they're not the quick twitch speed burner TCU and to some extent Oklahoma, again, wide receivers. Lil Jordan Humphrey he's given the Big 12 fits all year long, especially to your kind of deep ball discussion earlier, just kind of throwing it up. I'm curious though, we saw, especially in the conference championship game, where in that first drive, there were 2 wide open receivers, I think both down the middle, if I remember correctly, and Ehlinger just missed them. They ended up bullying their way down the field, and he kind of rammed it in for a 10-yard run up the middle. But he missed major opportunities on that first drive that would have been easy touchdowns. Is this the kind of game where they could put up 30 or 27 or 45 points against an Oklahoma because those defensive opportunities are going to come up a lot more, and that if they don't hit on that wide open wide receiver the first time, it may not be there the second or third time? Is that where the difference for Texas is going to be, where they could just bully their way down and ultimately kind of get the touchdown? Against Georgia, it might not be there if they miss it.
I think so. And you say missing it, I mean, it's missing it on both sides of the ball. So if you're a Georgia fan and you're not so familiar with Texas, we talk about their big receivers. They're really big. In the last Oklahoma game, Colin Johnson had 8 receptions for 177 yards. Colin Johnson is 6'6", 220 pounds. Third leading receiver in that game is little Jordan Humphrey, kind of to a certain extent kind of the star for the team. He's 6'4", 225, which is right around the same size as Julio.
I mean, these are Ole Miss wide receiver size players.
Yeah, they're A.J. Brown or A.J. Brown or bigger. I'm trying to remember the guy they had a few years ago was even taller. But that's the kind of guy you're dealing with. So when we talk about jump balls, we don't throw out stuff like that lightly. And a lot of people talk about, we're, jump ball potential, A.J. Brown or who have you. One, kind of fun discussion, A.J. Brown hasn't really been in any way effective at jump balls this year, very quietly for Ole Miss. I think DeMarcus Lodge has been better. But Texas, when we're talking about jump balls, they've got a 6'6", 220-pound receiver. They've got a very tall, very athletic target.
You're saying it as a function of their offense, not as a player.
Right. It's a little bit different. It's not the normal sort of 50-50 thing. You got to take your shots. No, that's the way their offense operates. But to your point, I think one of the interesting sort of conflicts here is if Texas isn't clicking on all cylinders and they miss things, I think the potential for negative plays is tremendously higher here on missed throws. Georgia has capitalized on errant passes and offensive mistakes to an incredible degree throughout the season. They've scored a lot of non-offensive touchdowns. DeAndre Baker, it seems like anytime a ball gets tipped, somehow DeAndre Baker ends up with it. And I'm not quite sure how that's happened this season, but it has. I think, though, the other side is how much can you actually force Texas to do it? Again, Georgia, for all their strengths defensively, Georgia does not get a lot of pressure. They're one of the worst teams in the SEC in sacks. They're one of the worst teams in the SEC in tackles for loss and pressures. It is what it is.
Don't tell Alabama that.
Well, I still haven't figured that one out, really. That game, you have to be a little careful when you watch those games as a one-off, right? Because the Alabama-Georgia game, from a Georgia perspective, it was definitely a positive, and you hope it's something that goes forward. They hadn't really been that disruptive all year. Not in any way that consistently. So I think what you should expect to see, if you see what you've seen throughout the season, is Texas is going to have a fair amount of time to operate. The Big 12 may not be very good defensively. I think sometimes in the SEC, it kind of gets discounted that they're used to playing passing games on a frequent basis. And they've got a lot of pass rushers in that conference, and they've got a lot of blitz packages against the pass. The one thing they try to do is not to give you forever to throw. Not that anybody's had success against Oklahoma, but they're probably going to be able to pass pro pretty well because they're really used to doing it. That means it's up to Texas at that point to use the time they have and execute at a high level. That all hinges a lot on Ehlinger and his ability to execute the offense. I think a lot of Texas fans would be excited based off where he was in certain parts of the season with his ability to execute, but this is a completely different game in terms of Georgia's ability to cover the windows he's going to have in this game. Texas has not seen a defense that is in any way remotely as good in terms of their ability to stay in coverage and run man for man with receivers in a game and fight for the ball. Athletically, in terms of just overall talent and ball skills, Georgia is truly on a different level than anyone else Texas has played. That's not me sort of beating a drum for SEC. It's just me being realistic with Georgia. Again, number one recruiting class last year. I don't know the last time, maybe Texas playing USC, though their recruiting's fallen off quite a bit. Texas is not used to playing teams that are more talented than Texas. Georgia is more talented than Texas. And I think that is going to be an interesting challenge, and how well Ehlinger executes against that talent level has to be a determining factor in this game.
Looking down Texas's schedule, I want you to answer this like thinking about how these teams match up and what is, where Georgia has benefited in the past or struggled in the past, because we saw them against LSU, and where Texas, what kind of matchup fits them well. The fact that Texas, in a league that is really poor defensively, Texas and Iowa State are the only two that have really stepped up. And I know Texas isn't highly ranked, but they have played a lot of good offenses. When you see scores like 23-17 versus Baylor, 24-17 versus Kansas, 24-10 versus Iowa State, 19-14 Kansas State, 31-16 TCU, we see a Texas team holding Big 12 offenses, some bad, some good, to well below their season averages. Is it in Texas's favor, given their opponent, Georgia? So I guess I should say it this way. For Georgia, is it better that they're playing a team that might not be very good offensively, but is the best the Big 12 has to offer defensively? Or would you rather, if you're going to take advantage of Georgia, see an Oklahoma-type team that plays no defense, but that can score in buckets?
I think if you were Georgia in this game, I think Oklahoma might have been a more interesting matchup in certain ways for Georgia, honestly. Georgia's offense is very potent. Georgia's offense is really, really good, really underrated, not just in the run game. They're a potent offense in terms of a passing game, too. That Oklahoma-Alabama matchup's getting a lot of love from a lot of people for the fact that you've got the classic sort of offense-defense matchup, et cetera, et cetera. I think what a lot of people sort of miss in that conversation is Oklahoma's number 1 in S&P offense, Alabama's number 2, Georgia's number 3. Georgia, I think, could try to keep pace with Oklahoma, but the challenge for Oklahoma would be Georgia's secondary is as athletic or good as anybody in the country. And Georgia would be able, all year, they've had a very good ability to keep teams from having a lot of big plays. That was particularly true after Campbell ended up being benched and replaced. They were way, way more effective as a team, I think, in that Alabama game, really due to that transition. So to me, if you're Georgia and you play Oklahoma, you feel like you're not going to give up a ton of big plays. You feel like you're going to be able to score every time you get the ball and it's going to work. Texas is a little different. We talk about this a lot. Certain teams are well geared to trying to score against anybody. Texas has not really exploded on any opponent all season, to your point. They haven't run through their schedule and really blown up a lot. They did it against Oklahoma, and their defense, it wasn't very good. They got in the 40s against West Virginia, Texas Tech. They haven't necessarily, though, 24 points against Iowa State, 24 points against Kansas. 19 points against Kansas State. They haven't been able to consistently do it against teams with better defenses. I think what that sort of signals to me is that Texas is going to get theirs, which is going to be the 20 to 30 point range, more than likely. But that may not have happened, but that's probably realistic. And the question is, can Georgia beat that pace? I think Georgia can certainly beat that pace, but it's a challenge to do so. Texas is athletic enough to give Georgia some issues. If they're in the Oklahoma game, I think they may have had a little bit more in terms of an advantage, and that they'd probably score every time they have the ball. Anytime you have a dominant run game the way Georgia has, and you're playing a really bad defense, you're going to score pretty much every possession. Because if you're getting 9 yards of carry, it's hard to screw up. You can't throw an incomplete pass on a run, basically. Every play should go more or less for positive yardage. So, playing Texas, I think, takes that away a little bit. And there's a little more there in terms of if Georgia doesn't execute or come in motivated, maybe Texas can step up defensively, make a game of it, and score a little bit. Again, utilizing really those big receivers because the run game ain't great. And that's sort of my take on that.
I think it's an interesting point. We made it in a couple other videos that everybody thinks about Alabama and Oklahoma, but Georgia's right there offensively. I will say, though, that scoring efficiency is good. The numbers, the pure point numbers aren't as good, but the style is different in how Georgia is a lot of back shoulder throws, still a very pro style approach. They don't spread around a whole lot, although they did show a lot of 4 wide against Alabama. So given what we've seen with Texas and how they've struggled against West Virginia, Oklahoma State, and Oklahoma. Everybody else they did pretty well against. So sort of a different way of approaching the previous question, does Georgia's style offensively lend itself to being a little more defensible if you're Texas versus some of these other, maybe in Alabama or Oklahoma or West Virginia?
I'm going to say probably not, honestly. And the point I was making earlier with Oklahoma really boils down to the fact that Georgia may not score a ton of points. It may not at times be extremely explosive. And don't take that the wrong way. It's a relative point because relative to their efficiency metrics, they're not as explosive as they are efficient. Their ratings are really high in a lot of advanced metrics because they focus on efficiency, which tends to hinge on how good you are in the run game. If you can keep ahead of the chains in the run game, your efficiency is usually quite high. If they played Oklahoma, if you're that efficient, you're going to be able to march down the field. The question is that a good thing or a bad thing? If you're Texas, would you rather play a team that's explosive or a team that's efficient? Again, now I'm not trying to just parrot back numbers, but I'm trying to use numbers to justify my position, talking about efficiency, explosiveness, whatnot with the matchups. Texas's defense has been more bend but don't break than otherwise. They haven't really been fantastic at generating a ton of negative plays, or that really, more importantly, they haven't been fantastic at keeping teams from moving the ball with some consistency. Statistically, 58th in the country in success rate, 38th in explosive defense. So they skew more towards bend but don't break, don't give up the big play. The problem is they're a very average team in terms of efficiency defense. That's a problem with Georgia because the way the team, you can have some success with Georgia defensively, and Alabama did this in the second half of the SEC championship game and the national title last year, really. You have to get Georgia out of their normal offense. You have to not let them run the ball when they want to run it and throw it when they want to throw it. It's really hard to do because their offensive line is so good. Their backs are so good. For the most part, and basically against everyone they've played, they've been able to control it. The one time that they really didn't run their offense the way they wanted was the LSU game. Now, we've talked about that at length. The LSU game, by and large, was a game where Georgia was able to run the ball for more than 6 yards per carry. They got down in that game due to various circumstances. They panicked. They moved away from their typical game plan, and their offense was not nearly as effective when they were a pass-first offense as it had been when they were a run-first efficiency-style offense. So if you're Texas, I think it's probably a problem that they're an efficiency-style offense because that means you can't go bend but don't break. If you do that, if you're not aggressive, then you let Georgia dictate the rhythm of the game when they're on offense. Georgia in rhythm is extremely hard to stop offensively. you have to disrupt them. You have to put them in circumstances where they're not comfortable, where it's 3rd and 9 and that kind of thing. They're not in that a lot this year at any point, and that's how what you have to do to be successful. And that's so far the season hasn't really been the MO for the Texas defense.
You mentioned rushing, and Texas fans are going to think that we're just killing their team. We're not killing your team. It didn't. To me, the matchup isn't great for Texas. I do think of the Big 12 teams, they're the most physical in terms of keeping up with Georgia's physicality. And I kind of disagree with you because I think that I do think that on one side you got Georgia's physicality, but the fact that these spread them out teams and a lot of RPO style teams and West Virginia bombing them over the top, those are the teams they really struggled with defensively. I think that Texas can match them a little bit there, but we saw DeAndre Swift run up and down the field against Auburn, who is the 37th, I think, ranked defense. Texas is 35th in overall run defense, 42nd in average yards per carry defense. So we're looking at about the same kind of defense in Auburn. Is the fact that Texas, I think they're 94th in rushing, is the fact that Texas doesn't run the ball and can't defend the run any better than Auburn, is that where the whole thing just kind of breaks down and that's your ball game?
Theoretically, that's the edge in this game. I think a lot of people probably have a bad impression in terms of the gap between Georgia and Texas overall, that Georgia is just in any style of football they wanted to play 60 points better than Texas. Frankly, I don't know that that's true, analyzing this game. The problem is, like you said, it's a matchup issue. It's the fact that Texas isn't a great run defense. It's the fact that Texas is not a great efficiency defense. And I think some people will take umbrage with it, noting, Texas is 3rd in the Big 12 in sacks. Well, the problem is, one, Texas played 13 games, and only Oklahoma also played 13 games. They're 5th in the Big 12 in sacks per game at 2.3. That's right between Texas Tech and Oklahoma. So, again, nobody in the Big 12 has been particularly disruptive. I do think the inability to keep Georgia off schedule that I'm currently seeing on paper really sort of skews things in a particular matchup problem for Texas, because Georgia, and this is the real issue and the crux of it, right? Georgia, whether you want to say that they're one of the four best teams in the country, I tend to think they probably honestly are, even though I don't think they should be in the playoff because they lost 2 games. And it really just is that LSU game. It's not nearly as bad as Ohio State and Purdue, but at some level you have to punish teams for getting blown out in a season. And that second loss was just killer. And you're going to need a lot of luck to get in with 2 losses. You almost have to be a conference champion. Georgia, all that stuff said, is a really, really good run offense. If you can't stop the run and get them off schedule, they're really just too good to beat. I think that's probably the short answer of this whole conversation. But I do think it's interesting in terms of the matchups, interesting in the fact that Texas probably is a lot closer than many envision. And I think the model actually bears fruit to that point.
All right. Well, since you mentioned the model, why don't you go ahead and show us what the model says, and we'll go from there.
So in this game, one of the first things that we like to talk about is a neutral statistic, which is a percentage of opponent averages allowed. If your opponents get 5 yards per carry on average, you allow 4, you allow 80% of their averages. It's a plain neutral opponent adjusted statistic. It's a lot more useful than looking at yard per carry allowed or yard per average allowed or something like that, or total yardage certainly, because this is factoring in exactly how strong your opponents are, a number of plays run, et cetera, et cetera. Georgia allows teams to have 93% of their opponent rush averages. That is a very mediocre number, frankly. We always say 95% is the mark of being average because everybody's statistics are inflated by playing group of 5 teams that aren't very good, that play bad competition, so their offensive numbers are inflated. You really want to be below 95%. Elite teams are going to be below 75. So if you looked at Clemson this year, Clemson allows teams to get 55% of their opponent rush averages, just to give an idea of how far off those numbers we are. Georgia defensively, though, is very good against the pass. They're 77% of opponent passing averages. Texas is a little bit flipped. Texas allows 85% of opponent rushing averages. That's actually a good number. It's not a great number, but it's a good number. But they allow 93% of opponent passing averages, which is a pretty darn poor number. So the first thing I want to point out from that is I think a lot of the perception of these teams, Georgia is a big physical team. Texas, maybe, we talked about this efficiency perspective, that they struggle with a run. Well, this first number, what it's pointing out is if you really adjust for opponents and opponent strengths, Georgia has struggled actually pretty badly against the run, and they've been awesome against the pass. We've had a lot of defenses in the SEC this year that were the opposite. Missouri, Texas A&M, something to watch in the bowls. They are awesome against the run, and they are horrifically bad against the pass. Georgia is weak on run defense. It's why they lost to LSU, pretty much in a nutshell. But Texas, I think, is the interesting one. Essentially, Texas is facing a lot of teams that are a lot more explosive running the ball. Oklahoma is a great example that gets credit for. And why Texas, I think, hung into that game is that their run defense was at least capable of not giving up huge plays, that they made Oklahoma earn it. Where Texas has had struggled throughout the season, though, is they're not a great pass defense. Anyway, moving on. Based off all the data, what it suggests here is that Georgia is going to average about 5 yards per carry, about 8.7 yards per attempt. Texas is only expected to average about 3.5 yards per carry and about 5.9 yards per attempt. Now, generally, 4.5 yards per carry and about 6.5 yards per attempt is the mark you need to hit to be competent in either phase of the game. So Georgia is competent in the run, a little more than that, and pretty darn good against the pass. Getting up to 9 yards per attempt is quite good. Texas doesn't hit that mark in either category. The offense is not expected to be effective. That really, by the way, that's due more to how good Georgia is offensively than it really is the two defenses. It's the gap in offensive quality that's causing that disparity. 6.5 yard per play to 4.6 yard per play advantage, almost 2 yard per play advantage for Georgia in this game. But what I think is interesting is the model doesn't project this to be a massive blowout. It has it 32 to 26. Get a little more specific, it's about 32.5 to 26. And this really gets back to the statement I made earlier. Texas has, like a lot of offenses with that kind of style, where you're not kind of the opposite of Oklahoma. When you're relying on guys being wide open constantly, you fluctuate really heavily with defensive averages. Going to be an interesting thing to see how it handles against Alabama, because we don't quite know how Oklahoma scales down on the low end. Texas has been more consistent. They don't score a ton against great, good defenses, but they're going to get they've consistently been able to get their 24, 27 points, basically, except that one Kansas State game. That they've been able to hit that mark. So that's why the model thinks they can hit 26, even though they're not going to move the ball well. They can actually score some points anyway. Georgia gets their 32 a lot more honestly. They move the ball much more successfully. It's just Georgia kind of stays in it in a scoring perspective, according to the model, even though Georgia really controls the game to a certain extent.
I'm not entirely surprised that it has the score closer, partly because our model is so much based on opponent averages, and Texas defensively does a really good job, like we said before, of holding opponents below their normal average game defensively. The problem, I think, with this a little bit is in the Big 12, yes, there are some better offenses, but in the Big 12, there are poor defenses. So if you play defense like Iowa State, in a computer model, Iowa State's going to fare very well. And before y'all get at me in the comments about how SEC doesn't play good defense, and this is not an SEC rant, this could fit for any conference, but this is what y'all say, and this is what they've been saying in the Oklahoma-Alabama thread. SEC doesn't play any offenses, and that's why their defenses are inflated. That's not actually true. If you look at how the SEC does outside of the SEC, they score more points than they give up fewer points. Look at Ole Miss, 47-27 versus Texas Tech this year. They go into the SEC and they score like 17 points per game. And so anyway,
South Carolina and Texas A&M both had the highest yard per play average that Clemson allowed.
Right. And a good example, everybody was saying Alabama's defensive numbers were overinflated and Oklahoma's going to shock them. Alabama played 8 top 50 S&P offenses this year. Oklahoma only played 4. The problem inside the Big 12 is you have really good offenses like West Virginia, and then you have really terrible offenses like TCU and Kansas and Iowa State that you have a few that are good, and then you have the rest that are really bad. So anyway, that's why Texas, I think, a little bit shows up in the numbers here. Offensively, I think that 93% that Georgia allows rushing is another thing that's in Texas's favor in terms of the numbers in the model that might not necessarily show up in the field because Texas, again, is used to running the ball against Big 12 defenses. This could completely prove out the other way in that, kind of what the narrative is that the offenses are great in the Big 12 and the defenses are better than they show. I think Texas is a good defense regardless. They did better against Maryland, even in the loss. They did get better against Maryland than Ohio State did. So I'm going to go ahead and give my score prediction on this. I think it's a little bit wider margin. I don't think Texas, even though they are a physical team relative to the Big 12, and they have some really physical players at certain positions, some in the secondary, they have some, and obviously at wide receiver. I'm going 37-20 Georgia in this one, and I have a lot of respect for what Texas has done this year. I don't love their start, but we even said that the Matt Canada thing in the opener against Maryland, that's a weird offense that can really get clicking, and we didn't really hold that against Texas. They bounced back against Southern Cal. I don't love the Kansas State game. I like that they play defense inside the Big 12. It's right now it's them and Iowa State. TCU had some injuries this year which hurt them, in terms of defensive statistics. So I like what they're doing. I don't think they're there at quarterback to really stress this Georgia team, but I also look at LSU, who is definitely not there at quarterback, not there at offense at all, and they out-physicaled Georgia a lot in that game. So that's the one kind of data point for me that's keeping me from fully loving my 37-20 pick, because I feel like I know Texas doesn't have the secondary that LSU has, but they also do have some of those pieces that gave Georgia fits. But anyway, 37-20. Tell me what you think.
The first thing I'll comment on is try to explain a little bit or push further with you were talking about the SEC versus the Big 12. Something that is happening a lot with 9-game conference seasons is teams are more isolated and statistics are more isolated. I don't care what you do to adjust statistics. We have very, very few data points that correlate the Big 12 versus the SEC. Some of those data points are really negative. So we don't want to skew it too much, because Ole Miss thumping Texas Tech, if we took that as gospel and just ran with it, it would say that every Big 12 team is grossly inferior to every SEC team. Kansas State against Mississippi State, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think those games are truly indicative. So, but the problem is, because I don't think they're indicative, I have no way to really adjust for stats. To Daniel's point, if you had a defense that was playing high school football and held every team to 2 yards per play, and then you try to project how they would do against Alabama in a statistical model, the statistical model is still going to think they're going to do okay, because it has no idea how a high school offense is going to translate unless you do something to manually tweak it. I don't think this is like high school versus college. I'm not saying which team is on which side of the divide. I'm making the point that these conferences are so isolated that it could be that one is at a significant disparity versus the other. Our inclination from having watched it just from our own eyeballs is that defense as a whole in the Big 12 is just not as good as what we're seeing in the SEC. That causes the numbers to be skewed quite a bit. I don't think Texas is going to really be able to stop Georgia's run game. I've said it all video. Because of that, I think Georgia scores a little more than the model's expecting they will. I think the model isn't too far off on Texas's own output in this game, honestly. I think they get about 24 points. I just think Georgia gets basically another touchdown in there at some point. So I have it 41-24. I will tell you something interesting. While you were sitting here talking a second ago, we often talk about Vegas lines and over-unders just for a discussion point, but we never look at them until after we've done the model. They're not posted before we do our models, almost always. Our model right now is predicting 32-26. The over-under is 58 points. So our model is dead on the over-under for this game. It's completely consistent with Vegas line. The difference is our model has this game at 6 points where the line's 13. It's suggesting, and usually you think that's a really positive thing for Texas. That's the general inclination most people have when they hear that is, oh, our model says it's closer, but it's 13 points and they won by even more. It's actually usually, in my experience, it's the opposite. If our model says this is a 6-point game, but the line is 13, that's Vegas saying the numbers and what people think they know about these two teams is probably not really true. Vegas, in a sense, to me, is usually saying there's something about this game where Georgia it should be favored by a lot more than the metrics would suggest, than the score should suggest, or the yardage should suggest over the course of the season. They're better in some way. There's a matchup issue or what have you. I think the matchup issue in this game is Texas's run defense and the inability to keep Georgia off schedule, and how good Georgia was at the end of the year when they were on schedule. That's why I think Georgia, I don't think it's going to be an absolute bloodbath, but I think Georgia's going to be able to pull away from this game and win convincingly in a somewhat hard-fought game.
And I don't think that's ridiculous to say. Texas is a 9-4 team coming out of the Big 12, has, losses to unranked teams. I don't think that's ridiculous to say. But I wonder if we see this game as, if we wake up day after and Texas has gotten the win in this game, is it the case that we were wrong about the run defense and that Texas was able to hold Georgia's run defense down and its lower scoring? Or is it that Sam Ehlinger put the team on his back and they were able to score a much higher number than we're currently anticipating?
I think if Texas has success in this game, Ehlinger is going to kind of have to put the team on his back. And I think to a certain extent, the dialogue is Ehlinger put the team on his back. I don't know that that's really true. I think it probably is going to have to be more the receivers putting the team on their back, because they're going to take some shots and they're going to rely on those receivers to get open and they're going to rely on them to make catches. On one hand, Georgia really has not been very successful at any point at stopping the run. They gave up over 5 yards per carry to Alabama and 3 touchdowns on the ground, over 150 yards rushing in that game. Even though that game felt like one Georgia was in control for most of it, Alabama still ran the ball fairly successfully almost the entire game. I just don't think Texas is good enough to take advantage of it. Texas has not rushed for 4 yards per carry since the start of November. They didn't do it against Texas Tech, Iowa State, Kansas, or Oklahoma. Those are not necessarily 4 great defenses.
No, they gave up again to the Ole Miss data point in Texas Tech. Because if you look at, so Ole Miss got Bowman in that game, and Oklahoma got Bowman, and then he got hurt, and Duffy came in. So it wasn't like Ole Miss got Duffy at quarterback. But if you take the Texas Tech offense off the table, they still gave up 200 yards to an Ole Miss running back. That, to me, if Texas can't have a day against that defense, then, to your point, there's a reason why they're ranked, 94th in rushing offense. If they ain't running on Texas Tech, they ain't running on Georgia.
And Georgia is a better run offense than Mississippi State. Would you agree with that statement?
I would. Mississippi State has 2 really good running backs and a good running quarterback, so it's a little different because they can get yards from different ways. But Swift would be by far the best running back on the field, and Holyfield probably the second best running back on the field if they played Mississippi State.
Right. And Kansas State played Mississippi State in the opener, and they got trucked. They gave up 9.9 yards per carry, 384 yards on 39 carries. And when they played Texas, 3 weeks later, they gave up under 4 yards per carry.
So, but is this a thing that it's not that big a deal because maybe Texas is just not? They want to get some rushing yards out of Ehlinger. They want to get 50 yards a game out of him, a couple touchdowns maybe. But they're really just going to be a pass first team and play good defense, and they don't really care about the running game. So we're docking them for it, and it's not really fair.
I don't think that's really fair. And people sometimes wonder, or people will bring up that point, right? Well, they didn't run the ball a lot. And I know that you're kind of begging this question. This is why we use yards per play. If you don't run the ball very much, if you're not focusing on the run, it should actually be more effective in our metrics, because the change-up run, when teams are geared up against the pass and they got their ears pinned back, that's when you get the running back draws for 12 yards. That's when the run game is more effective. The run game is less effective when you're running the ball. You're Clemson with Kelly Bryant or you're Alabama with Jalen Hurts and you're running the ball 3 out of 4 times and everybody knows it's coming and they got 9 in the box. That's when the run game really slows down. When you're spreading it out and the run game's a complement, the run game, all the big, run and gun offenses and your run and shoot offenses, usually the run game actually has really good yard per carry stats, even though they don't have a ton of yards. What we're seeing from Texas is they're not getting yardage. Now, they actually run the ball a lot in a lot of these games, but yeah, I don't think you can't just take the lack of focus and use that as an excuse. I don't think it is. Again, Kansas State, one data point. I know we only have a couple, but the couple of data points we have comparing SEC, Big 12, really hint to us that the run games in the SEC have been a lot more effective in the run, or the run defenses in the SEC have kept the run games in check a lot better than we have seen in the Big 12. I'm not saying that's determinative in this game, though I think Vegas kind of indicates it probably leans that way. It's kind of my inclination. But the one thing it does tell me is it's probably unlikely that Texas does better than expected. Because what our model is saying is if you treated the Big 12 and the SEC essentially as equal, that's what our model is mostly doing. It's more or less saying the SEC and the Big 12 are equal. Texas still doesn't get 4 yards per carry because of how dominant Georgia was relative to the SEC. If you think the SEC was better all around offensively, defensively with the run game, against the run, with the run, that gets even more disparate and it gets out of hand. So if you're Texas, you really hope these numbers are accurate more than anything, and you hope the two conferences are equal, so you get 5 yard to 3.5 yard per carry. That's a good result. The bad result is actually more like a 2 yard per carry game from Texas and a 7 yard per carry game from Georgia, and that's when you get the nightmare blowout that a lot of Georgia fans are rooting for.
All right, anything else on this one?
I think we've hit this one about as much as we can. I mean, the final statement here really is, at this juncture, we haven't seen an SEC team play in a bowl game. We don't know how these two conferences match up. The Big 12 did not play in a lot of out-of-conference games that ended up being overly meaningful, either because the team in the Big 12 wasn't great or the team the Big 12 was playing ended up not being great. So we're just going to have to wait and see. I do think the Oklahoma-Alabama game, unsurprisingly, that game is going to be a canary in the coal mine. You've got two teams that both, the team that gave Oklahoma the best game, the team that gave Alabama the best game, are playing each other here. So however well Alabama does against Oklahoma, that should give you some idea. The matchups are going to be different, so it's not going to be universal, but it'll give you some idea of how the two conferences correlate.
All right, y'all, please remember, subscribe if you like it. Let us know either way in the comments what you think the score is going to be. And look, Texas fans, we hoped to give a little better outcome. And then, after we looked at the numbers, the computer is pulling for you. And we thought that maybe before we really got into our scores, it might be closer than this. But right now, it looks like Georgia's going to come out with a win here. But that's why they don't play the games on paper. That's why they don't use computers to determine outcomes. That's why they play them on the field. So, y'all, let us know what you think about it. We'll talk to you in the comments. Thanks so much. Have a great week, and God bless.